Buddhism remained the main religion, but Taoism was still popular among people who wanted more spirituality than Confucius offered. And then Buddhism began to make headways into China. Now, weirdly enough, the Chinese did not accept Buddhism as their official religion on the grounds that the Buddhism, they said, is a foreign religion. We don't like foreign religions. They rejected Christianity on the same basis. Now, it has been said by some people that Christianity was first introduced to China around the year 100, or in other words, 70 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, if you believe that. But 70 years after Jesus left the earth, Christianity found its way to China. The Chinese have never officially embraced it. I mean, individuals have. Same with Buddhism. They looked on it as being a foreign religion. Now, weirdly enough, in 1949, China embraced a foreign doctrine called communism. But communism was obviously a foreign, but they didn't care. They were ready to accept it. But they did not accept Buddhism. Now, some of them did. Buddhism was believed to have been brought into China from India by traders. A lot of traders would climb the mountains and make the long and difficult journey to China, or some of them took a ship from India to China. It's not a straight route, but it can be done. And they began to spread Buddhism into China. Your book shows a statue of a horse from that time, a Han Dynasty horse. Painting, Chinese became excellent artists. As was the case with all Chinese dynasties, the Han Dynasty came to an end, and eventually the Qin Dynasty took over. Now, as was the case with the Roman Empire, the fall of the Han Dynasty was slow and gradual. They've been told for generations. And one of the problems they had was the increasing number of poor people. And they just simply did not seem to find a solution for poverty. And these poor people would get together, join up with someone who seemed to be strong, and they would try to overthrow the government. And eventually they did. Wang Mang was the last of the Han emperors, killed in a coup d'etat. Don't worry about the name, I promise it will not be on the test. Wang Mang, all right, this is somewhat the sad part of the story. And it reminds me of what happened in Russia in the 20th century. Wang Mang tried to reform. He tried to abolish slavery, improved a lot of the poor people. He began to confiscate the big rich estates. In other words, basically taking money from the rich, taking wealth from the rich to redistribute it among the poor. Communism of a sort. It did not work. He was killed, and his reforms came to an end. Now, I said, remind me what happened in Russia. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when, in the case of the Russian premiers, every time they had a reform-minded premier, and I'm thinking particularly Gorbachev, the people would rise up and overthrow him. But the only way to keep power in a country like that is to wield it with a very firm hand and not let anybody take over and kill everybody who opposes you. And it reminds me again of Saddam Hussein, who it took some people from outside, namely the United States and the coalition, rising up to overthrow him. And when they overthrew Saddam Hussein, the place in Iraq became worse than it was under him. Do I like what I'm saying? Not a bit. But sometimes, folks, that's the way it goes. Reform is sometimes, look in European history. There was a reform-minded ruler of Austria, Joseph II. He tried to reform Austria, and everybody, they would go, oh yeah, his reform, he wanted to abolish serfdom, he wanted to set up religious freedom, and everybody opposed it. Reform sometimes seems to be the absolute worst thing you can do in a country, even when reforms are needed. But anyway, Wang Mang was killed in a coup. Now, as for what all was going on in China at this time, there's something I want you to notice. The parallels between Rome and China. Their population at the first part of what we're studying was, but in both cases, it was going up and up and up until about the 100s, the 2nd century, and then it took a noticeable decline. Now this was true both in Rome and in China. And you all probably know what I think caused the decline. Anybody remember what I said last time?
Prosperity.
Not prosperity so much as something else.
Peace and prosperity.
Okay, you're a little bit off. Global cooling. That's the answer I really want in this case. Global cooling. The climate cooled. Yeah, the climate cooled. When the climate cooled, that farmer would get out and plant the same crop in the spring. Whoops, they'd say to themselves, it's April 10th, and it's time to plant, except it become a big frost after April 10th, something that had not happened before, maybe. And well, they'd go ahead and plant what little seed he had left, but the problem was the seeds that had grown in years past would not grow. Global cooling, among other things, meant that the same crops you'd lived on for years would not grow. Yeah, there was a time of global cooling that brought along plagues and pestilences. Now, I did say that prosperity was a big enemy, but in this case, the global cooling, such as it seems to have been, now we can't prove it so much in the 2nd century, but it seems to have affected the whole northern hemisphere. Now, you cannot prove anything about it in the New World, in North America. But both the civilizations in the Roman Empire and the Chinese Empire experienced storms, famines, and crop failures, and this led to unrest, civil unrest, war, both sides. Your book points out that both Rome and China, they're similar. They both lasted for centuries. They were both successful in setting up centralized control. They both set up provincial officials, men to govern the provinces, and seemed to work pretty well for a while on both sides. In both cases, they started out with a family, with a man at the head of the family. Again, this is right in your book. With a man at the head of the family in most cases, both sides of the big continent. But in the case of the Romans, the authority of the father was undermined and weakened. Much more so than it was in China. In both sides of the big continent, wealthy landowners were able to buy out a lot of the land, and a few wealthy owned all the land, while your ordinary person got to owning less and less. This happened on both sides. And in both sides, the free peasants eventually became tenant farmers, farmers who paid rent and had no chance to own. Now, in Rome merchants were given more freedom and were more highly esteemed in Rome than they were in China. And some people believe that this was one of the things that was eventually to lead Europe to become richer and stronger and greater than China. Now, in the short run, folks, Chinese civilization fared better during the dark days of the 2nd century than Roman civilization. The Roman Empire crumbled and collapsed and fell and never was to revive. China did not crumble. China went downhill. They went through a period of chaos, but they revived much quicker than Rome did. In the case of Rome, it took 600 or 700 years before they began to pull themselves back up by their own bootstraps. In the case of China, they remained downhill for maybe 200 or 300 years, and then they were pulling themselves back up by their own bootstraps much faster than Western Europeans. But in the long run, in the short run, China was far ahead. In the long run, Western Europeans forged ahead, and one of the reasons might have been Western Europeans looked more favorably on traders and merchants than the Chinese did. In other words, it was going to take your traders, your merchants, your businessmen to pull things up And no, Europe was not perfect in regard to the way it treated its merchants and its businessmen. Some of you might have grown up. How many ever heard of Robin Hood? Most of you, yeah. Would pride himself on seeing a fat merchant and believed it was his duty to rob from the merchant. And a lot of Europeans had this same attitude. Hey, merchants are filthy rich. So what we're doing is going to take money from the rich and give it to the poor. We had our own Robin Hood in our history, a man named Jesse James. Most of you might have heard of him. Jesse James, when he'd see a poor farmer, he'd stop the farmer and ask how he was doing, and oftentimes he and his men would share some of their loot with the farmer. He'd use this to justify what he was doing. Rob the rich banks and give the poor farmer. The thing that's wrong with it, believe it or not, society would better off had he robbed the poor people and used that money to give the rich. And I say, hey, that's, no, the richer the rich get, the richer the rest of us will get. So if you want to rob from somebody, rob from the poor and give the loot to the rich. You'll improve society better. Believe it or not, I mean, it sounds drastic, but when you rob from the rich to give to the poor, when the rich get poor, the rest of us get poor. The richer the rich get, the richer I'll get. Let the rich forge ahead and get as rich as they can. Sooner or later, they're going to spend that money they earn. And when they do, the rest of us will benefit. But Europe was not perfect in the way it regarded its merchants, but nevertheless, they were better off than were the Chinese in the way that they regarded merchants. And now we're going to talk in a couple of chapters about a man who was married to a merchant. The man's name was Mohammed. And all Mohammed's mind just went in turmoil because he'd grown up in poverty and just believing all his life that rich people were evil. And guess what? One day he became rich. And his mind couldn't handle it. But, I mean, hey, I've told you, I don't care who knows. I grew up in poverty. But I don't believe it's wrong to be rich. If you can get it, fine. Go for it. The more wealthy each of us get, the more we all benefit. Anyway, now both Europe and China experienced invasions by nomadic peoples. Nomads. Particularly the Mongolians would come from Mongolia, and Europe was infected by the same Mongolians. The Huns were Mongolian people who were cast out of Mongolia by their own fellow Mongolians. They came to Europe. Their relatives went to try to bother the Chinese. So both sides were beset by nomadic invasions. The word nomad. All right, the word nomad means people who wander from place to place. Now this is going to be on one of the tests. I don't know if you'll get the question or not. And I think it's really on test 3, not test 2. But the word nomad means that people who wander from one place to another, either following where the game goes or following where the herds go, or if they have tame herds like sheep or goats, when these herds have eaten up all the grass in this area, they'll find another grassy area and move their herds there while the grass grows back where their herds have been. But people who follow the herds, for whatever reason or another, follow the game, follow the herds. These are nomads. These nomadic invaders beset both China and Rome. In the case of Rome, the nomadic invaders brought them to ruin. In the case of the Chinese, they were able to fight them off. One big difference. And the Romans, it's known that the Roman people, people in this boat travel more. The Chinese typically would be born, grow up, marry, and die without ever having traveled more than 4 or 5 miles from the place he was born. A lot of your Roman people traveled hundreds of miles. The biblical book of Acts gives an account of what life was like in the Mediterranean world in the 1st century. And it depicts people who were traveling from one place to another. But it's known that a lot of people in the Western world traveled a lot. Generally, Chinese didn't. So, the big difference, again, one big difference between the Roman and the Chinese world. The Roman world completely collapsed, went fragmented, and the Roman Empire ceased to exist. China was hard hit. China did not collapse. Big difference. Otherwise, they were a lot alike.